Hi there, welcome to the first in a set of 3 videos where we're going to be looking at covering our balsa models in heat shrink film. Now in this first video we're going to be looking at the tools that we need and the preparation that we need to do before we start covering that model. In the second video we're going to be looking at a very basic covering, so just a single colour covering the underside of a wing and how we do that. Now in the third video we're going to be looking at doing something a little bit more complex. We're going to be using different colours and we're going to have a design on a wing and how we can do that effectively and over an open balsa structure, which is a little bit trickier than when it's sheeted. Right, well let's first consider the tools that we need to allow us to put a covering on our balsa model. Now, one of the most important things I think is a couple of scalpels. I find scalpels brilliant for this type of work. In fact, I use them for all my building, but particularly when I'm covering with film, because the blades are nice and thin and they're lovely and sharp, really nice, and you can take the blades off really quickly and change them. And I would recommend having a good supply of scalpel blades and changing them regularly, because it's surprising how dull and how quickly they become dull when you're cutting film, and you really want to get nice sharp crisp cuts. And also the glue on the back of the film often goes onto the blade, and even though it doesn't look a lot, it can just stick and catch when you're starting to cover the film, and just, you know, you can end up with a ragged edge. So perhaps one of the most important things is a really nice sharp blade, and a blade that has been changed regularly so it stays sharp. And I use 2 different scalpels. I use a number 3 handle with a number 11 blade, and it's quite a long thin blade, and it's a really quite nice for working with film. The other one I use, and to a lesser degree, is a number 4 handle, and that has got a number 26 blade on it, and that's you can see the blade is quite big when you compare it to the number 11, and I was just going to put this on so you can see. So you can see the 2 blades on there, hopefully, and that 26 really is quite a good blade, but when you want that little bit of extra reach, really good. So something nice and sharp. Also, it's really useful to have some good straight edges, not only for measuring your film but for cutting it. And if you're cutting long lengths, rather than a ruler, which I find that the film can often move underneath, it's not as secure when you're holding it to cut, getting something like a straight edge. This is a metre long straight edge, and I've got a slightly smaller one here. I just find the extra weight of these, the extra width, really useful when I'm cutting film. Now, to actually apply the film, we're going to be using a heating iron, and it's a heating iron specifically designed for putting on this type of heat shrink film. Now this one I use is a Prolux digital iron, and I've used this for years, and I've covered lots and lots of models, both this type of more traditional heat shrink film, but I've also used it on laminating film for covering vintage models. And it's just so accurate having the digital gauge on it, and it goes from 100 degrees C up to be honest, I don't know what the maximum is, but I know I've had it up to about 220 when I'm doing laminating film. Certainly don't want it that kind of temperature for heat shrink film. So a good digital iron is indispensable to my mind. Now, I never use a sock, or very rarely use a sock. I know people do, and they often come with a sock. This type of iron I find will never ever scratch the film. I've never scratched the film. What I do find is if you've got a particular soft piece of sheeting, you have to be very careful with the corners because you can actually dent the balsa under the film if you're not careful. And a sock is beneficial for that and can help, but I still don't use a sock. I find having the bare iron you get is a lot more tactile, a lot more positive, a lot more feedback. So I prefer to risk the dents for that increased sensitivity, if you like. Now I've got a blow lamp or a heat gun here, which I find really useful in certain specific circumstances. I have shrunk covering on big wings with it. I've heated up difficult patches, but you have to be so careful with a heat gun, because if you get it right, it can be really useful. If you get it wrong, you just blow a hole in the covering because it gets too hot. I mean, this has got a variable temperature on it, and I do find it useful for some coverings, particularly on laminating film on my vintage models. In the videos subsequent to this, where we're going to be actually doing some covering, I doubt whether I will use that iron, but I'll have it on hand in case there's something difficult and I think like a bit of a crease that I need to get a little bit more heat to. But like I say, I'm kind of always reticent to use that. Now, the other thing I would suggest, which I think is really important in covering, and I'm just clearing the deck a little bit so we've got some space, and I'll just move my rulers actually. Now, when we're covering our models, and this is a balsa flying wing that I've put together and I'm going to be covering, it's always useful to work on top of a towel. Now, this is just a cheap towel, it's a few pounds, cotton towel, and it's lovely because it prevents the model from getting scratched while you're working, so you're not damaging the model before you've even got it covered, which is really useful. But also, just the nature of the towel gives a little bit of friction on the bench, so it's not sliding about quite as much. Now, I've got another pile of towels here, and I find these really useful because, for example, if we look at this wing, we can see it's rocking around a bit. So all we need to do is just put a little bit of a towel under the edges, and all of a sudden this just becomes so much more stable, such a better working platform. And it might be that if we're working on this, we do still keep getting a little bit of lift. So a towel just placed on the wing like that really does stop it from moving about, and particularly if we're working on a wingtip and we're trying to stretch the film around a wingtip, having something to hold that end is really useful. Now, another useful reason to have towels, and a good cotton towel, is because when you're working with your iron, and I mean, when I first started using this iron, it came with a little metal stand, and I used to use it and put it on, and it was sliding all over the place, and you'd have to look and put it down, and it kind of drove me a little bit mad, to be honest. And I suddenly realised that actually I don't need that stand. All I need is a nice cotton towel that's not going to melt like a nylon kind of material. So when you're working and you want to put the iron down, you can just put it on the towel. It's just a great stand. You're not worried about putting it on your cutting mat where it might melt it, or on your bench or whatever. Just a cotton towel to be able to place your iron on is just so useful. It's also a really good idea to plug your iron in on the side of the bench that you're working from. So as you're working on the model, putting the film on, you haven't got the cable draping across what you're trying to do. My original workbench had a socket at the back, and I was constantly trying to get the cable out of the way as I was working, which literally drove me nuts. So having it plugged in at the front is a huge advantage. And finally, on the tools and materials kind of side of things, there's a couple of final things that it's worth having. I always use some Scotch Magic tape when I'm covering, whether it's to hold the film initially in place when I'm starting, and you'll see that in the subsequent videos, or maybe there's a bit of a flap that I want to hold back of the film while I'm working on something else, just so it doesn't get in the way. And Scotch Magic tape is really good for doing that. And finally, it's always useful to have an extra pair of hands, because you never know when you're going to need something just holding while you cut it or trim it. So anyway, let's have a look at some of the preparation now. Now, before we start covering our model, whether it's a fuselage, a wing, it doesn't matter what kind of plane it is, if it's a balsa model and we're going to start covering it, we need to think really carefully about the preparation of the structure. And that applies to any kind of balsa model. And the second thing we need to do is we need to get an understanding of the film we're using and how it reacts to different temperatures. Now, with regards to the preparation, once we've started covering this, that's it. Any blemishes, any high points, bits that aren't quite profiled right are going to stand out under that covering. It's too late to do anything about it. So we really need to make sure at this stage, before we start covering, that we've got it sanded, lovely and smooth. There's no high spots where the cap strips are, or the leading edge, you know, that's the right shape. You really need to go over this with a fine tooth comb and a really nice, soft, sort of fine garnet paper. Because like I say, once you start covering, it's too late to go back, or it's not easy to go back if you find that something is not quite right. And if you haven't got your joins right on your sheeting, then it's really going to stand out. The covering film that you put on, the heat shrink covering film, really shows any imperfections really quite nicely, and that's not something we want to see. So preparation, I think is really important before we start covering these models. You know, we've spent months and months, sometimes years, building these models, so we don't want to let it down by just for not doing you know, a couple of hours of nice sanding and preparation. Now, I have done a video about sanding, and there'll be a link in the description below to that video. Now, once we've got our model nicely sanded and we're really happy with it, we need to have a look at the film that we're going to be using. And I've got some Orocover here, and I really like Orocover. I've done a review of this. If you have a look at my playlist, you'll see, and I'll put a description in the link below. It's not one of the cheapest films. In fact, it's probably one of the most expensive films, but it does go on really nicely. But I have used a lot of other films, and there's a lot of good films around now that you can get that will do quite a nice job. But it's really important that we understand how our film responds. And I would suggest either getting a bit of a scrap wing like this, or even just making up a small section, a small frame, you know, just this kind of size, this top half, so that you can experiment with a little bit of the film. I mean, this stuff, you know, it's fairly expensive, so we don't want to use too much of it. So just having a small frame, that kind of size, will allow us to, and something that's not flat, that's got curves on it, maybe a difficult bend on a corner, and just playing about with your film for half an hour so you get an understanding of, one, what is the minimum stick temperature? What's the minimum temperature you can use to stick it to the frame? Because the last thing you want to do is bump your iron up really hot, start to sticking it down, and the film immediately shrinks. You don't want it to shrink when you're just sticking it down. It makes it a lot harder. So knowing what the temperature is that you can get away with, I think with Orocover I'll probably use about, I think it's about 115 degrees C, but I will check that again. I mean, Orocover comes with some decent instructions on temperatures, which I've always found to be pretty reliable, but I will check it again before I start, just in case there's a batch difference. So knowing what temperature it sticks, and then knowing what temperature you can use to start to shrink it. The point at which it stops sticking and starts shrinking is a really useful point to know when you've got it all stuck down and you want to start shrinking it and getting it to fit nicely and getting rid of those wrinkles. And what temperature can you use? What's the maximum temperature you can use before the film starts to go a little bit sticky, or you burn a hole in it, or it doesn't respond very well? You just need a feel for that. If you dive in and start covering a structure and at the same time experimenting with your temperatures, learning what temperatures you can use, it's kind of a little bit of a recipe for problems. So try and get to know your film. And I've just realised I forgot to say something about preparation. So I'll just say this now. Once you've sanded it, the only thing I do is I connect this brush up to my industrial vacuum, workshop vacuum, and I give it a good vacuum with this brush, and I get off the dust. That is all I've ever done with models. Actually, I tell a lie, I used to wipe them over a little bit with a tack cloth or a damp cloth, but I find that just vacuuming the structure is all I need to do. The film sticks lovely. I've never had it starting to come loose, never had any problems at all. I know some people like to put sanding sealer on it, dope on it, various finishes, and sanding it before they do the covering. I personally don't find that necessary, but I understand that people like to do that, and that's fine. But like I say, I just use the vacuum and give it a good brush. Now, the final bit of advice that I can give, and probably the most important bit of advice on this whole video, is not to be too hard on yourself when you're doing this covering. If you're just starting out, it does take time, it does take practice, but every model you work on, you learn, you adapt, and you get better. And I mean, I've covered countless models now, and when I first started, I found it very, very daunting and difficult, and I was making mistakes. But it's surprising how quickly you can learn, and I think it's important that we recognise that we're learning from these models every time we cover them. And I think if we've got something that we're not happy with, and nearly every model I cover, I get to a point where I've done something and I think, oh, I really don't like that bit. And I consider what I can do about it, whether I should start again or whether it's okay. And in that kind of situation, I would say, leave it until the next day and have a look the next day. Because it's surprising how when you've spent all day covering something and you've got a little bit of a wrinkle in the end, it looks huge and it seems like a catastrophe. And yet the next day, if you come and look at it, you can't even find it half the time. So I would say don't be too hard on yourself and too critical, because like I say, we're learning all the time, and as long as we're doing the best we can, that is the most important thing. So I hope you found this video useful and interesting, and I hope you're looking forward to coming back and seeing how we start getting on covering this wing. And in the next video, I'm going to be covering the whole of the underside of this wing, just in a single colour. I'm going to be doing it in this black Orocover. And then in the third video, we'll be doing the top of the wing, and we'll be using this cub yellow and the black again. But we'll be doing a design where we've got the yellow in the middle with black, and something like that. I still need to bottom that out, but it's going to be a more complex design, and we're going to have the joins over the open structures, which can be a little bit tricky. So anyway, I'm going to draw this video to a close now. So thanks very much for watching, and please come back and see how we get on covering this wing.